A fateful morning. The relentless buzz of the alarm clock broke the stillness of the early morning hours. Oat Harper groggily reached out and silenced it, the numbers on the display mocking her exhaustion. 5:30 a.m. The weight of the day ahead hit her as she tried to shake off the sleep that clung to her like a thick fog. Today wasn't just another regular day. It was the day of her final constitutional law exam. The culmination of 3 years of grueling work, sleepless nights, and countless hours spent dissecting case laws, legal precedents, and tortuous textbooks. Her heart pounded in her chest at the thought of how much hinged on this one exam. Would she pass? Would she graduate with the honor she had worked so hard for? She sat up, her feet meeting the cool hardwood floor of her cramped Boston apartment. She glanced at her reflection in the small mirror on her bedroom door, her disheveled hair and tired eyes reminding her of the toll this journey had taken. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Today was about resilience. Today was the day that would determine her future, whether she continued on the path she had carved for herself, or whether she would be forced to reassess everything. Her morning routine was a blur of hurried motions: shower, coffee, breakfast, a quick glance over her notes. But there was a quiet voice at the back of her mind, urging her to trust in the preparation she had done, in the weeks and months of review, in the knowledge she had absorbed. As she double-checked her bag, making sure she had everything: pens, ID, a bottle of water. Her fingers brushed against the small polished stone she always carried in her pocket, a gift from her grandmother. The stone was meant to bring strength and clarity, a token of comfort whenever doubts crept in. Her grandmother had given it to her when she left for law school, promising that it would remind her to stay focused and grounded. Aunt closed her eyes for a moment, clutching the stone in her hand, silently praying for a little bit of luck and a lot of strength. She needed both. The streets of Boston were already bustling as she stepped out into the cool morning air. The city seemed alive with purpose, a mirrored reflection of her own drive to succeed. She moved quickly through the crowded streets, a briefcase in one hand, her coffee mug in the other, making her way to the subway. Her mind raced, running through key points she had studied for the exam. The anxiety swirling in her stomach was like a tight knot, but she did her best to push it aside, focusing instead on the tasks ahead. When she reached the subway station, the usual crowd of commuters was already gathered, their faces buried in books, phones, and newspapers. Oat stood on the edge of the platform, her thoughts still preoccupied with the case law that was fresh in her mind. But then something caught her attention. A brief commotion near the edge of the tracks. An elderly woman, her silver hair elegantly pinned back, stood teetering dangerously close to the edge of the platform. A floral scarf draped loosely around her neck fluttered as she swayed, her body tilting like a tree in the wind, about to topple over. Without thinking, Oat's instincts kicked in. The briefcase and coffee mug slipped from her grasp as she surged forward, her heart racing. The crowd around her seemed to fade into the background as time slowed down. She reached the woman just in time, her hands grasping the frail shoulders of the elderly lady, preventing her from falling onto the tracks. The woman's knees buckled, and she collapsed against OT, her head spinning as OT struggled to keep her upright. "Someone help," Ot shouted, panic in her voice, as she eased the woman to a sitting position. Her hand shook as she checked the woman's pulse, trying to stay calm. "Can anyone call an ambulance?" The crowd, momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events, began to react. A few people pulled out their phones, dialing for help, while others murmured in concern. Oaken knelt beside the woman, her face filled with concern. The woman's eyes fluttered open, but they were clouded with confusion. Her hands trembled as she reached out to grasp Oat's hand. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Oat asked softly, her voice filled with concern. "Can you hear me?" The woman blinked a few times, struggling to focus on Oat's face. Her pale blue eyes were unfocused, but slowly they locked on Oat's. I don't know what happened," she mumbled, her voice trembling. "Everything just went black. Ott squeezed her hand gently, trying to soothe her. "It's okay. Help is on the way. Just stay with me." The elderly woman's grip tightened slightly, and for a moment, Ott felt the faintest pulse of strength in the frail body. "My name is Margaret," the woman whispered, her voice quiet but steady. "Margaret Reed." "Margaret, it's okay," Ott reassured her, doing her best to keep her calm as she waited for help to arrive. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, and soon the paramedics arrived, rushing to the scene. Ott stood up, stepping back as they began to assess Margaret's condition. But then, a cold wave of panic washed over her as she glanced at her watch. The exam had already begun. She had missed the first 15 minutes, and she could feel the weight of the decision she had made. She had chosen to help, but at what cost? She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Margaret, who was now being loaded into the ambulance. Her heart twisted in her chest as she thought about the exam waiting for her. It was a make-or-break moment for her career. But she couldn't leave the elderly woman alone. "Not like this. I'll ride with her to the hospital," Ott found herself saying, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. She shouldn't be alone. One of the paramedics nodded, acknowledging her decision as he moved to secure Margaret in the ambulance. Ott's hands were shaking as she grabbed her belongings, her briefcase and coffee mug, which a kind stranger had picked up and was holding out to her. She gave the stranger a grateful nod before climbing into the ambulance beside Margaret. As the vehicle pulled away from the station, OT couldn't shake the feeling that this decision, this selfless act, might change everything. But whether it would be for the better or worse, she couldn't yet know. The weight of missing the exam pressed heavily on her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to regret the choice she had made. The sirens wailed in the distance as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, and all Oat could do was silently hope that the universe would find a way to repay her kindness. But at that moment, with Margaret clinging to her hand and the chaos of the world moving around them, Ott knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a much bigger story, an unexpected turn. The bright lights of the emergency room flickered overhead as O.T. Harper stood silently beside Margaret Reed's bed. The steady beeping of medical equipment filled the room, its rhythm oddly calming against the storm of thoughts racing in Oat's mind. The hours had stretched on, but still, she hadn't moved from Margaret's side. It wasn't just her sense of duty that kept her there. It was the realization that Margaret was more than just a stranger she had helped on a whim. Margaret had become something of a lifeline for O.T. in those tense moments at the subway station. She had been the reason O.T. had chosen not to follow the well-worn path of urgency, the path that led straight to the final exam, the one that was supposed to define her future. As the paramedics had wheeled Margaret into the hospital, O.T. had become more and more uncertain of her decision. She had seen the disappointed messages on her phone, heard the buzzing notifications, all of them reminders of the test she was missing. She had silently questioned her choice. Was it the right thing to do? Should she have abandoned Margaret, even for a moment, to make it to the exam? The stakes were high, and she knew it, but something had told her that helping this woman, this frail and vulnerable soul, was the right thing to do, no matter the consequences. Now, here she was, still sitting at the foot of Margaret's bed in the cold, sterile atmosphere of the emergency room, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. She tried to focus on the elderly woman in front of her, but her mind was a whirlwind of worry about what she had given up. Margaret had been awake for some time, her breathing shallow but steady. The doctors had done their rounds, taking blood samples, checking her vitals, and ensuring that her sudden fainting spell wasn't a sign of something more serious. While the doctors seemed to think it was just a dizzy spell, possibly triggered by dehydration or exhaustion, they hadn't ruled out more serious conditions yet. "Miss Harper," a voice interrupted her thoughts, and Ott looked up to see a tall, distinguished man walking briskly into the room. His salt and pepper hair was slightly tousled, and his suit, though expensive, seemed a little rumpled, as though he had rushed to get here. The worry lines on his face were deep, and his eyes were a mixture of concern and relief as they settled on Margaret. What happened? Is she all right? Margaret's face lit up at the sight of him. Carson, dear, I'm fine. Just a little dizzy spell. This lovely young woman helped me. She saved me, really, Margaret said, her voice trembling but warm. The man, Carson, visibly relaxed as he approached the bedside, placing a hand gently on Margaret's frail shoulder. I can't thank you enough for what you've done, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. His eyes then moved to OT, taking in the young woman sitting quietly beside Margaret. You must be OT Harper, right? The student from Boston University. Ott stood up, surprised by his recognition. Yes, I'm OT Harper. I'm just glad I could help, she replied, suddenly unsure of herself. A wave of awkwardness washed over her as she wondered how much he really knew about her. Carson's gaze softened, and he gave a small, appreciative nod. Margaret has told me about you. She's been in the best of hands, I can see. But please, there's no need to feel awkward about it. You did something incredibly selfless. Not at all. Ott stammered, but Carson cut her off gently. You were there when no one else was. And that makes all the difference. As Carson spoke with the doctors, Ott found herself feeling a sense of warmth she hadn't expected. Margaret's words about the help she had given her felt so simple, but to Carson, they seemed to be enough. And suddenly, Ott realized that she wasn't just an exhausted law student caught in a rush to finish an exam. She was a person who had made a choice that would change her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Minutes passed, and Ott felt an intense sense of dislocation. She had missed her constitutional law exam. Her entire future felt suddenly uncertain. But despite the gnawing fear about what this might mean, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. Not now, not in this moment. She had been part of something bigger, something that mattered. Miss Harper, Carson's voice interrupted her reverie again, and she turned to face him. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to ask, where are your final exams today? Ott's heart skipped a beat at his words, and she nodded slowly, her throat tightening. Yes, I missed the start of my constitutional law final, she said, her voice faltering. She didn't mention how it had been the exam she had studied for tirelessly over the past 3 years, the one that could make or break her graduation. Carson's face darkened. This isn't right. Missing that exam because of a medical emergency. That's not something you should be punished for. His voice grew more authoritative as he spoke, and OT couldn't help but feel a sense of relief flood her. The way he spoke, with such conviction, made her feel like maybe she hadn't ruined everything with her decision. Have you contacted your professors about the missed exam? Carson asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Ott shook her head, a deep sigh escaping her lips. No, not yet. I've been here all day, and I didn't know what to say. Carson seemed to think for a moment, a plan forming in his mind. Well, I'm on the board of trustees at your university. I'll make sure the dean hears about this. Missing an exam due to helping someone in need. It's unacceptable to let you be penalized for that. His voice was firm as he pulled out his phone. Wait, Mr. Reed, I can't, Ott began, but Carson had already dialed the number, speaking quickly into the phone. Within minutes, Carson hung up and turned to OT, his face breaking into a reassuring smile. It's all arranged. The dean agreed. You'll have a chance to take the exam tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The relief that washed over OT was immediate and overwhelming. She found herself speechless, her eyes welling up as a mix of gratitude and disbelief filled her heart. You're really helping me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course, Carson replied, his smile kind and warm. You helped my mother when she needed it most. The least I can do is make sure you're not penalized for doing the right thing. As Oak stood there, trying to process everything that had just happened, Carson paused, as though considering something. Actually, there's something else I'd like to offer, he said. Reed and Associates, my law firm, offers summer internships to promising law students. I'd like to offer you a position, starting next week. Ott's mind raced, unable to fully grasp the enormity of what Carson was offering her. Reed and Associates was one of the most prestigious firms in the city. An internship there could change everything for her. It could propel her career into a new stratosphere. Yes, Ott said, before she could even think it through. Yes, absolutely. I'd be honored. Carson extended his hand to her, smiling broadly. Excellent. We'll be in touch with the details. Now, go home and get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day for you. OT felt as if she had just stepped into a different world. A world where the kindness she had extended to Margaret was coming back to her in ways she had never imagined. As she left the hospital, still in a daze, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. She had no idea how much more was in store for her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. New beginnings. The night after O.T. Harper had helped Margaret and received the unexpected offer from Carson Reed felt like a whirlwind of emotions. The drive home was a blur, with the usual sounds of the bustling city streets seeming far away, as though she were in a different world. Her thoughts kept returning to the surreal kindness Carson had shown her and the incredible turn of events that had unfolded in just a few hours. Missing her exam had seemed like a catastrophe in the making, but now it felt like nothing more than a fleeting moment. She had been offered a chance to take the exam again, and what's more, Carson had extended an internship offer to her at Reed and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in Boston. As she unlocked the door to her small apartment, O.T. was struck by the quiet. The space felt so empty, even though she had lived there for years. Her heart still raced from the excitement, but a part of her remained uncertain. She hadn't earned the internship yet, and the reality of taking the constitutional law exam tomorrow loomed large. She tossed her keys on the counter and collapsed onto the couch, closing her eyes for a moment, attempting to clear her racing thoughts. Despite the reassurance she had received, a sense of unease continued to press on her chest. The fear of not measuring up, of not being good enough, nagged at her. It was a fear she had known for a long time. The pressure to succeed in a world that constantly seemed to demand perfection, where any misstep could derail her entire future. But then she thought of Margaret, how one small act of kindness had already altered the trajectory of her life. It was a reminder that sometimes the best things in life didn't come from striving for perfection. Sometimes it came from simply being there for others when it mattered most. Maybe that was what she had been missing all this time. A little bit of faith in herself, in her instincts, in the universe's uncanny ability to lead her exactly where she needed to be. The next morning, Ott arrived at Boston University School of Law an hour early, her nerves tight in her chest, but with a clear mind. She had spent the night reviewing her notes, grateful for the unexpected second chance, and now all she had to do was walk into that exam room and do her best. As she entered the exam hall, a hum of voices and the shuffle of paper seemed strangely distant. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had prepared for this moment. This wasn't about a single exam anymore. This was about more than just the test in front of her. It was about proving to herself that she could succeed, no matter the circumstances. The proctor handed her the exam papers, and the clock began ticking. As she began to read the questions, Oates' mind sharpened. It was as if everything fell into place. The long nights, the study groups, the coffee-fueled mornings. She recalled every legal precedent she had memorized, every case study she had dissected. The anxiety that had gripped her the night before seemed to melt away. She wrote with confidence, her pen moving across the pages without hesitation, outlining arguments, referencing cases, and drawing connections that seemed effortless. For the first time in what felt like ages, she was exactly where she needed to be. 2 hours later, O.T. handed in her exam, her shoulders finally relaxing as the weight lifted off her chest. She hadn't expected this moment to come so soon, but it did, and as she walked out of the exam hall, she couldn't help but feel a surge of accomplishment. Whatever the results were, she had done her best, and that, in the end, was all she could ask for. The next few days passed in a blur as OT waited for the exam results. The anticipation gnawed at her, but she tried to focus on the positives. The chance to prove herself at Reeve and Associates, the offer of an internship that was already starting to feel like a lifeline. Her phone buzzed with messages from her friends and classmates, all asking if she had heard back from the dean. She hadn't, and she didn't want to focus on it too much, not when there were more immediate concerns to address. By the end of the week, the results came in. Oat opened the email with a mix of dread and hope. The subject line read, "Final exam results, Constitutional Law." She clicked it open, her hands trembling. And there it was. She had passed. Not only had she passed, but she had done so with honors, something she hadn't even dared to hope for in the chaotic aftermath of the previous days. A wave of relief washed over her, and for a moment she stood frozen, unable to believe it. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Carson. "Good news?" he asked simply. Ott smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She typed back quickly, "Yes, I passed, and I can't thank you enough for all your support." Carson's reply was swift. "I told you you'd get through it. Now, get ready for your first day at Reed and Associates. I'll be there to welcome you on Monday." The weekend passed in a whirlwind of emotions. Oat spent time with her family, sharing the news with them, and basking in their pride. They had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. But as much as she enjoyed the time with them, a part of her was already looking ahead to the internship that awaited her. She had no idea what to expect, but she was ready for whatever challenge came her way. The work would be intense, and the expectations would be high. But OT was no longer the same person who had entered law school 3 years ago. She had learned resilience, learned that sometimes the right choices didn't always align with the plan, and that sometimes life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. Monday morning arrived too quickly, and Oat found herself standing in front of Reed and Associates' imposing glass and steel building, her heart thudding in her chest. The sleek, modern architecture seemed to mock her humble beginnings, reminding her of how far she had come, but also of how much farther she had to go. She smoothed down her suit jacket and straightened her posture, trying to calm the nerves that had built up over the weekend. Today was the start of a new chapter, one that she couldn't afford to mess up. As she stepped inside the lobby, a friendly young woman greeted her at the reception desk. "Ms. Harper, Mr. Reed is expecting you," she said with a smile. "Let me show you to your desk, and we'll get you started with orientation." The office was everything OT had imagined, a vast open space filled with sleek furniture and an air of quiet efficiency. The hum of busy professionals moving in and out of conference rooms filled the air. It felt almost surreal to be here, walking among the very people she had admired from afar during her law school days. Emily, the young woman who had greeted her, led her to a small but tidy cubicle tucked away from the bustle of the main office. "This will be your workspace," Emily explained as she handed OT a stack of papers and an orientation packet. "You'll primarily be working with our corporate law team, but Mr. Reed mentioned that there might be special projects for you as well." Ott took a seat at the desk, feeling a mix of awe and uncertainty. She was here, finally. But now the real work began. She glanced around, taking in her new surroundings. The office was quiet, but beneath the surface, there was an energy, a palpable sense of purpose. Ott realized that this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She was ready. Her first day at Reeve and Associates passed in a blur of introductions, paperwork, and training sessions. She learned about the firm's culture, their clients, and the high expectations they had for every associate. By the end of the day, Oat felt both exhausted and invigorated. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, but she also knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. As she walked back to her apartment that evening, her thoughts turned to Margaret and Carson, the two people whose unexpected kindness had set this journey in motion. She thought about how one small decision to help someone in need had shifted the course of her life. As she looked up at the city skyline, she smiled to herself, knowing that the road ahead would be hard, but it would also be filled with new possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally on the right path. The heart of the challenge. The days that followed O.T. Harper's first day at Reed & Associates felt like a blur. She had settled into her new role quickly, diving into the work with a fervor that came naturally to her. The fast-paced world of corporate law was nothing like the theoretical, case-driven learning she had grown accustomed to at law school. But somehow, it was even more exhilarating. The stakes were real now. The cases, the clients, the research, everything mattered, and the weight of it was both daunting and empowering. Her first task at the firm had been to assist the corporate law team with a merger case between two massive companies, a deal that had the potential to shake up the tech industry. Oat had spent the first few days attending meetings, organizing files, and reading up on the particulars of the case, taking in the specifics and nuances. The volume of information was staggering, but Oki thrived under pressure. She had always been the type to rise to a challenge, and now that challenge had a tangible, high-stakes outcome. Each day, she found herself working closely with the senior lawyers, researching precedents, drafting memos, and in the evenings, poring over contracts that seemed to stretch on for miles. There were moments when the work felt overwhelming. The pressure to perform was relentless, and at times, Ott questioned whether she was truly cut out for the job. But whenever self-doubt crept in, she remembered the words Carson had spoken to her when he had offered her the internship. "You're something special." Those words kept her grounded, a constant reminder of the faith someone had placed in her when she hadn't yet believed in herself. It was late one evening, several weeks into her internship, that OT found herself in Carson's office again. He had asked her to stay late to review a new angle on the merger case. She had thought it would be another late night of paperwork, but when she entered his office, she saw that the case files were scattered across the desk, and Carson was standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline. "I'm glad you're here," Carson said without turning around. His voice was calm, but OT could sense the urgency in it. "Of course," she replied, stepping into the office and taking a seat across from his desk. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and there was something in his posture that made her wonder if this was just another case or if something bigger was at play. Carson turned, his eyes locking with hers, a slight furrow in his brow. "You've been doing exceptional work, OT, but there's something more I think you can offer on this case." Ott sat straighter, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "This merger, it's not just about numbers and legal technicalities. There's a lot of emotional and ethical weight behind it. One of the companies we're dealing with, Hartwell Tech, has been accused of engaging in some questionable labor practices. We're talking about forced labor allegations in overseas facilities. This isn't just about a financial merger. It's a moral one." Ott's eyes widened. She had heard of the company's rapid rise, but this was the first she was hearing of such allegations. Hartwell Tech was one of the biggest players in the industry, and this could make or break the deal. She had always known that corporate law involved complex ethical dilemmas, but this was a whole new level. "We're not just looking at numbers here," Carson continued. "We have to think about the bigger picture, and that's why I'm bringing this to you." "I don't understand," Ott said, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "Are you asking me to help sweep this under the rug?" Carson shook his head, his eyes steady. "No, absolutely not. What I'm asking is for you to dig deeper. We need to understand the full scope of these allegations and how they could affect the company's reputation and our clients' interests. I want your fresh perspective on this. I trust you." Ott was stunned. It was one thing to be asked to assist with a legal case, but it was entirely another to be handed something this complex, this morally loaded. This wasn't just about contracts and mergers anymore. It was about real people, real lives, and whether corporate greed would be allowed to thrive unchecked. The next few days were a blur of research and phone calls, her focus entirely on uncovering the truth behind the allegations against Hartwell Tech. She had never worked on a case like this before, one that was so rooted in human rights. The hours bowled into one another as she pored over court records, news articles, and internal reports from whistleblowers. The deeper she dug, the more horrified she became by the extent of the claims. Hartwell Tech had been accused of exploiting workers in overseas factories, subjecting them to deplorable conditions. Allegedly, employees were subjected to long hours, low wages, and were not allowed to leave the factory compound. Some reports claimed workers had been physically abused. Others suggested that the company had intentionally concealed information about these practices from investors and the public. OT spent every waking moment researching, cross-referencing, and compiling evidence. She knew that what she was uncovering could change the course of the case, but she also knew it would place her directly at odds with her firm's interests. Reed and Associates had built its reputation on corporate law, and the clients they represented, powerful, wealthy corporations, were not the kind of people who took kindly to public scandals. It wasn't long before OT found herself meeting with a group of whistleblowers who had worked at Hartwell Tech's overseas factories. They were hesitant to speak out, fearful of the consequences, but OT's sincerity and determination won them over. These were the voices that had been silenced, and now OT was going to help amplify them. One particular whistleblower, a woman named Maria, had worked at one of the factories for over 5 years. She was the one who had come forward with some of the most disturbing details. As OT sat with her in a small conference room, Maria explained, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "They've been exploiting us for years. We were treated like machines, not people. Some of us were forced to work 12-hour shifts with no break. The company would just move us from one factory to another if we complained. No one was ever allowed to talk about what was happening behind the walls," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. Ott took careful notes, listening intently. She had heard horror stories before, but this was different. This was real, tangible suffering. She knew that exposing this truth could destroy Hartwell Tech, and it could ruin her own career. But she also knew that exposing the truth was the right thing to do. As the days turned into weeks, Ott found herself working around the clock, struggling to balance the intense demands of the merger case with her new responsibility to uncover the truth. She barely slept, often working late into the night and into the early hours of the morning. But with every new piece of evidence she found, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't until one Friday afternoon, as she sat in Carson's office with a thick folder full of findings, that the weight of the decision she had made began to settle in. The moment had come. "Carson," Ott said, her voice steady but filled with resolve, "I've gathered everything I could on the Hartwell allegations. I think we need to reconsider our position on this merger. The evidence is clear. These practices can't be ignored." Carson leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her intently. There was a long pause before he spoke. "I knew you were the right person for this," Carson said quietly. "I'm proud of you, OT. You've done the right thing." But as OT looked at him, she realized that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, and it certainly wasn't always comfortable. She had taken a stand, and now there was no turning back. The breaking point. Ode Harper stood in front of the massive glass windows of Reed and Associates, looking out at the city below. Boston was bathed in the golden light of early evening, the skyline dotted with towering structures, each one a monument to ambition and success. The city had always felt so vast, so full of possibilities. But today, OT couldn't help but feel small, as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into a vast unknown. The Hartwell case had consumed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. What had started as a routine corporate merger was now a full-blown moral and legal crisis. As the evidence mounted, stories of mistreatment, abuse, and exploitation, Ott found herself increasingly torn between her duty as a lawyer and her growing conviction that the truth had to be exposed. The pressure to side with the firm, to protect the interests of their powerful clients, weighed heavily on her. But every time she looked at the files, at the faces of the people who would come forward to tell their stories, She felt an unshakable responsibility to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Carson. "Can you meet me in my office?" Ott's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this moment. Dreading the conversation she knew was coming. Carson had been supportive throughout this entire ordeal, but she knew that the time had come for the firm to make a decision. The pressure from Hartwell Tech's legal team had become unbearable. The firm had been losing clients, and the public relations nightmare that was unfolding was threatening to destroy Reed and Associates' reputation. She had already heard whispers in the hallways, murmurs of disappointment and frustration from her colleagues. Everyone was watching her now. Everyone was waiting for her to make her choice. Taking a deep breath, Ott walked toward Carson's office, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As she reached the door, she paused for a moment, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. She knocked softly, and Carson's voice called out from inside. "Come in." The moment she entered, Carson stood from behind his desk, his expression unreadable. The air in the room felt thick, charged with a tension that neither of them could ignore. Carson gestured to the chair across from him, but instead of sitting, he walked to the window and looked out at the city. Ott could see the muscles in his shoulders tense, the weight of the decision hanging over them both. "Ott," he began, his voice quiet, measured. "I've been thinking a lot about where we are with this case, and I know you've been working tirelessly, uncovering the truth about Hartwell Tech's labor practices. But the reality is, we're in a delicate position here. The firm is being squeezed from all sides, and if this case blows up, if it goes public in any way, we risk losing everything. Reed and Associates could be finished." Ott swallowed, her throat tight. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But the truth matters, Carson. The people who have been hurt by Hartwell Tech, they matter too." Carson's eyes met hers, and for the first time in weeks, Ott saw something in his gaze that wasn't just professional concern. There was a flicker of something deeper, perhaps fear, perhaps regret, perhaps the same inner conflict she had been feeling for days. Carson had always been someone she looked up to, someone she trusted. But now, standing in front of him, she realized that even someone as powerful as him had their own struggles. The weight of their respective choices was becoming too much to bear. "I agree with you, Ot," Carson said slowly. "But I'm also a realist, and right now I have to think about the future of this firm. I have to think about our clients, about our team. You know what's at stake here." He turned away from the window, his face tight with frustration. "If we expose this, if we let the public know what's really happening, it's not just Hartwell Tech that's going to suffer. It's us too. The reputation of Reed and Associates, the work we've done for years, the clients we've built relationships with, it'll all come crashing down. We'll be marked as a firm that can't keep its business private, and that's not something we can afford right now." Ott felt the pressure of his words settle over her like a weight. She understood the stakes. She understood the reality of what they were facing. But she also knew that the people she had met, Maria, the other whistleblowers, weren't just nameless faces in a file. They were real people whose lives had been ruined by the very company that Carson and the firm were now trying to protect. How could she sit idly by and let it all be swept under the rug? "I understand the firm's position," Ott said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But I can't ignore what's right. This isn't just about the firm's reputation or Hartwell Tech's profits. This is about people's lives. People who don't have a voice in this fight. How can we, as lawyers, be a part of something that perpetuates such injustice?" Carson's gaze softened, but there was a resoluteness in his eyes that Ot hadn't expected. "I'm not asking you to ignore it," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to think carefully about what this means. You're a brilliant young lawyer, Ot, and you've made your mark here. But this case, it's bigger than just us. It's about the future of the firm. If you go forward with this, if you take this to the press, or try to make a stand against Hartwell, I'm afraid it will be the end of your career here. And it could be the end of Reed and Associates." Ott's heart sank. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. She could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of losing everything. But she also saw something else, a flicker of doubt. Carson wasn't just concerned about the firm. He was struggling with the choice in his own way. This wasn't easy for him either. But the reality was clear. "Carson, I can't be a part of something that's wrong," Ott said, her voice steady, but filled with the emotion she had been holding back for so long. "I can't keep defending people who hurt others just to protect my job. I didn't become a lawyer to turn a blind eye to injustice." There was a long silence as Carson processed her words. His face seemed to soften, as if he understood, but the weight of the decision still loomed. Finally, he nodded, his expression a mixture of resignation and regret. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you can't, and I respect you for it, OT. I really do." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But you need to understand the consequences of this. If you go public with this, you will be going against everything the firm stands for. You'll be making an enemy of everyone in this industry." Ott stood up slowly, her heart pounding. She had already made her decision. She wasn't going to back down. She had fought too hard to get here. And now she would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. "I'll do what I have to do, Carson," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "And if it costs me my career here, then so be it. But I can't let this go. I won't." Carson looked at her, his face a study of conflict. "I'm sorry, OT," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "But I think you've already made your choice." As she turned to leave the office, Ott felt the full weight of her decision settle over her. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. She knew the consequences would be severe. But as she stepped out into the cool evening air, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She was doing the right thing. And for the first time in weeks, she felt at peace with the path she had chosen. The fall and the rise. Odie Harper hadn't expected it to be easy, but she certainly hadn't expected the backlash to be this intense. The day after her meeting with Carson, she had made the decision to take the Heartwell Tech case public. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't expose the truth. The very thing she had fought so hard to be, a lawyer who fought for justice, was now in direct opposition to everything Reed and Associates stood for. Carson had made his position clear. If she chose to go public, it would be the end of her career with the firm. And he wasn't wrong. The press conference had been arranged quickly. Ott had contacted several whistleblowers, including Maria, who had agreed to share her story in front of the media. It wasn't just a matter of legal duty anymore. It was personal. Ott was fighting for the people who had been exploited by Heartwell Tech for so long. But she knew that by doing this, she was taking a massive risk, not only to her career but to her future in law itself. The morning of the press conference, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Ott stood in front of a sea of microphones and cameras, her hands trembling, but her resolve steady. The room was filled with reporters, lawyers, and the weight of public scrutiny. The spotlight had never felt so overwhelming. Carson had tried to talk her out of it, urging her to reconsider, to at least give the firm a chance to resolve things privately. But OT couldn't be swayed. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into Reed and Associates with a dream of climbing the corporate ladder. The woman before them now was someone who had found a deeper purpose in the law, someone who knew that doing the right thing came with consequences, but also, sometimes, with an opportunity to change the world. "Ott Harper, thank you for being here," one of the reporters called, their voice cutting through the noise of the room. "Can you explain why you've decided to go public with the Heartwell Tech case? This is a huge decision." Ott's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, as she began to speak. "I've spent the last several weeks working on a case that involves the exploitation of workers at Heartwell Tech. What I've uncovered is nothing short of horrifying. Thousands of workers have been subjected to appalling conditions, forced labor, abuse, and extreme exploitation. Heartwell Tech has tried to hide these facts from the public, and I can no longer stand by and allow that to continue." She continued to outline the details, showing evidence of what she had found. Testimonies from workers, internal memos, and records that had been kept hidden. The room was silent as the weight of her words settled in. But the silence quickly turned into a flurry of questions, and Out found herself caught in the whirlwind of attention. "What do you plan to do next, now that you've taken this public?" another reporter asked. "I will continue to fight for justice," Ott replied, her voice resolute. "I'm working with a team of lawyers and activists to ensure that Hartwell Tech is held accountable for the crimes it's committed. I won't rest until those responsible are brought to justice, and the workers who have suffered get the compensation and protection they deserve." The press conference lasted for what felt like hours. Each question, each camera flash, each follow-up felt like an interrogation. But OT never wavered. She had already made the most difficult decision of her life. And now, there was no going back. Later that day, as she returned to her small apartment, Ott felt the weight of the decision finally settling in. She had gone public with the truth, and there was no telling what the fallout would be. Her phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from colleagues, classmates, and family members. Some of them were supportive, applauding her for her bravery. Others were less understanding, calling her reckless, questioning her judgment. She had already seen the articles, headlines condemning her actions, calling her a whistleblower, a traitor to her firm, a career suicide waiting to happen. The worst of it came that evening, when Ott received an email from Reed and Associates. The firm had officially severed ties with her, effective immediately. It was formal, cold, and devoid of any personal sentiment. The email explained that her actions had violated the firm's core values and ethics, and that they could no longer continue their professional relationship. Ott's heart sank as she read the words. This was what she had known was coming, but it still hit her like a punch to the gut. That night, as she lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling, a sense of loss and uncertainty swept over her. She had fought for what was right, but now she was on her own. No law firm would hire her after what she had done. Her career, which she had worked so hard to build, seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. And yet there was a strange sense of peace that came with the thought. She hadn't compromised herself. She hadn't bowed to the pressure of the system. She had stayed true to her principles, even if it meant losing everything. The following weeks were a blur of uncertainty. Ott had received numerous calls from the media, many of them wanting her to comment on the scandal. Some were sympathetic to her cause, while others sought to discredit her. Every day felt like a battle, and it seemed like no matter where she turned, someone was waiting to tear her down. But through it all, one constant remained: Margaret. The elderly woman she had saved on that fateful day at the subway station had become her greatest ally, her surrogate grandmother. Margaret was the one person who had never judged her for her actions, who had supported her unconditionally. It was Margaret who reached out to OT in her darkest moment. One evening, as OT sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through job listings that seemed increasingly hopeless, her phone rang. It was Margaret. "Ot, darling." Margaret's voice was warm and soothing. "I've been reading the papers. I know things have been difficult for you, but I want you to know how proud I am of you." Ott felt a lump form in her throat. She had always admired Margaret's strength and wisdom, but now her words felt like a balm to her wounded soul. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. And sometimes doing the right thing doesn't always come with immediate rewards, but I know you'll find your way. There's always a way forward, and you have a heart that's full of compassion and courage. That's more than any law degree can teach you." The words brought tears to Ott's eyes. She had given up everything for what she believed in, but in that moment she realized something important. She had lost a job, but she hadn't lost her integrity. She had lost the safety of her career, but she hadn't lost her ability to make a difference. A few days later, as Ott sat in her favorite cafe, looking over her notes for the Hartwell case, she received a call that would change everything. It was from a nonprofit organization dedicated to workers' rights, one that had been following the story closely. They had heard of her bravery, of her determination to expose the truth. and they wanted her to join their legal team. The offer was everything Oti had dreamed of, a chance to fight for the very people she had been advocating for, a chance to make a tangible difference in the world. But it came with a catch. The pay wasn't much. The hours would be long, and she would have to start from the ground up, rebuilding her reputation after the fallout from Reed and Associates. Without hesitation, Ot said yes. As she walked out of the cafe, her heart lightened, a sense of purpose filling her with renewed energy. She was ready for this new chapter. It wasn't the path she had planned, and it certainly wasn't the easy one. But it was her path, one that would allow her to continue fighting for justice, even if it meant sacrificing the conventional success that so many people sought. She had found something greater than a career. She had found a cause worth fighting for, and for the first time in months, O.T. Harper knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.